Hi, what's up? I'm Channel Pup, mascot for the Level-Headed Fanboy. And in the last episode of the Spider-Man retrospective, we were talking about The Amazing Spider-Man 2, what is, in my opinion, the worst of the Spider-Man films. Not that I think it's bad, but it has a very convoluted storyline, it's very unfocused, and the pacing absolutely suffers for it. But that ultimately doesn't really matter. What I think of the film doesn't really matter to this video, where we are talking about the aftermath of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. See, love it or hate it, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 dealt a massive blow to the Spider-Man film IP. Like, whether or not I think the movie is good or bad doesn't really matter. It has to be acknowledged the damage that this one film did to Spider-Man. For one, we need to look at the box office numbers from Sony's POV. The film grossed $709 million worldwide at the box office, but domestically it made $202 million, and this number here was ringing alarm bells. Domestically, that was a flop. And for global box office, Sony were aiming really for much closer to $1 billion at the box office, especially with the amount that they sunk into the marketing of this film. Sony at this time were in their own spot of financial bother as well, and Spider-Man was their ultimate cash cow. So the fact that it didn't bring in the money they hoped it would, that and the film receiving the worst reception of any of the Spider-Man films that Sony had produced, things had to change. Sony needed to explore their options going forward for the future of Spider-Man. And just when Sony Pictures were in the height of panic mode, another bomb drops. In late 2014, Sony is hacked, and a slew of internal documents and emails are published onto WikiLeaks, revealing the future and the death of the Amazing Spider-Man franchise. And that is what we'll be talking about today.
Mamma mia! You made it this far into the video and you still haven't subscribed? What in the name of spaghetti and meatballs is this all about?
You boy, why you not subscribe to the channel, Pup, yeah? And click on the link in the Patreon in the description below, or I'll fucking kill you, boy. Don't fucking test me.
That's a one spicy meatball.
Yes, it is.
So, guys, I'm gonna be real, the WikiLeaks website is pretty busted these days, so there are a few gaps in the evidence that I can present. So, there's not as much I can really put on screen as I wanted, but I did consult things like Reddit. I had to go through a few old chat logs with friends on social media when we discussed the leaks, and consult a few articles from around the time in order to get any kind of information on this video. Now, the leaked Sony emails prove that the non-creative higher-ups are like walking cliches. They're kind of as out of touch as the wealthy kind of bean counter character archetype you'd find in like a Mad comic. So we have a few emails here spanning across the production of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, starting off with one from Nick Shaw to Amy Pascal. And believe me when I say it is the peak of comedy. This email is from late 2013, when Amazing Spider-Man 2 would have been in production. The email reads, Spidey thought, "Hey Amy, just a couple of rando thoughts from 35,000 feet up LAX to JFK. A rising trend we see with millennials are the really extreme forms of experimental exercise, like Tough Mudder, a sort of filthy triathlon, the Color Run, and even things like hot power yoga, veganism, etc. Millennials will often post NBD on their social media after doing it, as in, no big deal, also known as the humble brag. Wondering if Spidey could get into that in some way. He's super athletic, bendy, strong, intense, and it's all NBD to him, of course. EDM, electronic dance music, is the defining music for millennials. Wondering if there's an EDM angle somewhere with Spidey. His movements are beautiful, would be awesome with a killer DJ behind it. Snapchat just launched a story functionality, which is sort of a day in the life of me, told in a series of Snapchats that expire after 24 hours. It has a very VIP quality about it, since invitation only. Getting invited into Spidey's Snapchat circle would be huge and very buzzworthy and cool. Oh my god. These films are made by boomers, aren't they? This is about as how do you do, fellow kids, as it gets, as he dissects what a Snapchat story is. But it does seem that they did really run with the EDM angle for Amazing Spider-Man 2. Not so much for Spider-Man, but Electro, which I must admit ended up being one of the more inspired decisions of the film, so go off, I guess, Nick Shaw. Big fat W's for you. That stands for win, by the way, Nick Shaw. It's like a form of congratulatory gesture. It's something people from Gen Z say a lot on Twitter. Okay, we started off with a bit of light comedy there, but let's look at this email from September 17th, 2012, after Sony Pictures president Alan Fine just read the script for The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and decided it was so bad that he wanted to burn it. This is from Alan Fine to Tom Cohen. Tom, first of all, your notes are excellent. In many areas, you actually take the works right out of my mouth exactly as I would say them. Oh yeah, just a quick note, none of these Sony execs can spell for shit. Well done. Therefore, I am only going to focus on a few overarching issues, several of which you already mentioned but deserve further emphasis, because I agree that they are so important. This story is way too dark, way too depressing. I wanted to burn the draft after I read it, never mind thinking about buying the DVD. I have a major issue with the overall strategic direction they are taking with the Spider-Man franchise. I think it is potentially very dangerous to undermine the significant events of the first Spider-Man trilogy. This new trilogy is, in essence, a prequel to the original trilogy. However, many of the events of this draft attempt to tell a completely different story. Example, in the original trilogy, Norman became the Green Goblin and lost his life in a battle with Peter. He did not die in his bed from a genetic disease. Harry did not become the Green Goblin. He became the Black Goblin. And hated Peter for supposedly killing his father. Harry and Peter went to school together. Harry did not go away to boarding school. In the original trilogy, MJ lived next door to Peter for as long as he could remember. They went to school together. She did not just show up after Peter graduated from high school. Uncle Ben articulated the famous words, "With great power comes great responsibility." Not Peter's father, etc., etc. I think that it is a mistake to deny the original trilogy its place in the canon of the Spider-Man cinematic universe. What are you telling the audience? That the original trilogy is a mistake? A total falsehood? We lied to you? We just made it up? Why should the audience buy into the world we create now? Will we deny its place in the Spider-Man cinematic universe at the next reboot? So, buddy, I don't think that Alan Fine seems to grasp what a reboot is, and that this is fiction, so yes, it is a falsehood. They did just make it up. Anyways, I was under the impression that one major reason for the reboot was to be able to put Peter back in high school, because we could tell better stories in that environment. So why do we begin this story with a graduation? Fair point, fair point. The chemistry between Emma and Andrew is so good and such a positive that I wonder why it's so necessary to kill her off in this movie. Let the relationship flourish and commit the deed in the next movie. Why rush? Their relationship was the best part of the first movie, and it's the best part of this story. This draft needs to shed some depressing weight anyway. Kind of agree with that, that's actually a fair point. This story, as did the first movie, feels so formulaic. Everything feels like it's been done before, with the exception of the girlfriend's death, which I feel is unnecessary and premature anyway. The unsuspecting, innocent, means-to-do-well villain victim, who turns into the hunted and hated monster. The girlfriend he desperately wants but can't have. Aunt May in financial trouble. Misunderstood and hated by his best friend. The only thing we are really attempting to change is the history of the Spider-Man cinematic movie canon of the original trilogy in order to make this story seem new and interesting. However, I don't think it works. I found this draft tedious, boring, and had to force myself to read it through. Just felt like every other Spider-Man movie, cartoon show, comic book story, same old, same old. I don't buy Electro's hate of Spider-Man. Feels manufactured, convenient, undeserved. It's a part of the whole formulaic issue I mentioned above. Why do we always have to witness the Spider-Man movie villain be created from scratch and imbue him with all of the reasons why he should hate the world, and especially Spider-Man? Why can't there just be some evil out there already, and Spidey is the first and last line of defense? Use some flashbacks to prove out the ruthless, bloodlusting darkness of the Beast, but don't bog down every Spider-Man movie with the complete creation and backstory of the innocent victim that can't even come to fully despise because of his evilness not being his fault. In any case, we need to develop some rules around the scope of Electro's powers. He seems to be able to do whatever he needs to do, whenever he needs to do it. I actually legitimately agree with that. It would be cool to get some out-of-the-blue Spider-Man villains. Of course, the overall story is way too long. 3 villains? Gimme a break. Wait until Alan Fine finds out about Spider-Man No Way Home, and Sony's plans beyond this if he thinks 3 villains are too much. Another of the leaked emails reveal Kevin Feige's notes after viewing The Amazing Spider-Man 2 for the first time. Now, this was an earlier cut, so there are a few things he mentions that weren't actually in the final cut of the film. But here's what he had to say. There are too many storylines and we need to choose which ones we are focusing on and lift out the other ones, i.e. could reduce Father arc to just Roosevelt. Could cut out plane crash and Richard destroying the spiders and start on the armored car. Don't start with Spider-Man. Let the danger and stakes to NYC build first, and then have Spider-Man enter the scene heroically. Tone down Paul Giamatti's performance, so he seems a bit more menacing and less cartoonish. If you cut Richard from the opening and the plane crash, you could maybe instead do Harry coming home and seeing Norman at the top of the movie as a cold open. Really love Electro. Feels like you may not need the scene in his apartment, which makes him seem completely crazy and hard to relate to. Like the idea that the eel goes in his mouth instead of burrowing and you see it glow within him. Need to set up the power plant earlier visually. Seems like the movie switches POVs a lot. Why are we in Max's POV during the car chase? Worth looking at this playing out from Spidey's POV. There could be a better way to reveal that Peter is missing graduation. Maybe when you cut to Gwen, you cut to the wide shot. Tiny note, I don't think Peter would lie to Gwen about the sirens. Maybe he just downplays it. As for the Stan Lee cameo, maybe we need a little more emphasis on Peter here trying to get out of his costume and not be seen. Set up a little more of the pressure of the principal getting closer and closer to calling his name. Instead of seeing the ghost of Captain Stacy, you can just hear the voice in Peter's head and maybe flash back to the last movie. I don't think we should add Captain Stacy back into the car chase. There is too much back and forth with Peter and Gwen. Can we recut the dim sum scene so it doesn't feel so repetitive of their breakup in the last movie? Can Peter be more honorable and definitive and less wishy-washy? Why do we need a year to pass? So, I'm guessing that there was maybe a year time skip between Gwen breaking up with Peter and then the big Spider-Man flying montage. Harry's story feels like the main plot of the movie. Peter should look into the past because of Harry. Maybe find some photos of them together as kids. Use the obsession wall more to set up this part of his past and not just what happened to his parents. Not sure what Peter learns at Roosevelt is entirely correct. We're distracted by the idea that Peter became Spider-Man because of his father's blood. All this special backstory with his super scientist dad fights the idea that Peter is a normal kid from Queens who becomes the greatest superhero in all the world. God, it is so refreshing to hear things about The Amazing Spider-Man 2 from someone who actually gets Spider-Man. Now, this is an interesting one. Andrew's performance is all over the place. A lot of crying and then a lot of mania. Hard to track him emotionally sometimes. It undermines his reaction to Gwen's death because he gets upset and emotional a lot. Going by the final cut of the film, I don't quite get this, and I certainly wouldn't place it on Andrew's performance, but, I mean, he saw a different cut, you know, I can't necessarily confirm or deny. I just thought Andrew Garfield was fantastic in the film, but I mean, I'm no professional. Don't like the idea that May tells Peter his parents were spies because 2 seconds later he finds out they're not and again fights with the idea that he's just an ordinary kid. I like the idea that May finds out he's Spider-Man, finds his costume instead of the Rosemary Harris wink wink all the time. I kind of like the morgue, but hate the dancing mortician. Cliché. Yeah, the dancing mortician you can find in the deleted scenes of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Are you using VFX to show how Electro is traveling from one point to another? Bursts of electricity? Need to underscore the capture of Goblin. More sirens as you linger on the clock. 1:21, 1:22 a.m. Nice touch. I have no idea what that is. Surveillance scene should be about following Harry, not Peter. No one should be following Peter. Can Electro hum Itsy Bitsy Spider before he plays it electronically? Maybe we can use this again. Maybe intercut the ending montage and hearing Gwen's speech with someone going into special projects and revealing more Easter eggs, and we see that the Rhino case has been broken into and that the suit is missing. Great way to transition to the Rhino ending. We don't need the scene of Aunt May in the kitchen. Spider-Man needs to feel more directly responsible for preventing the planes from crashing. Don't show New Yorkers looting. So I'm guessing that they actually did pay attention to some of Kevin Feige's notes here, because yes, there are some things that have been changed. For example, Oscorp are surveilling Harry instead of Peter. We didn't get any scenes of New Yorkers looting, and the dancing mortician was definitely cut. There was no year time skip in the early part of the film. So I do get the sense that, yeah, they might have paid attention to some of Kevin Feige's notes, but there are some notes here that are actually really good. I think having a cold open of Harry seeing his father again would have been a great way to start the film, so it's less, coming out of nowhere more something that's actually set up early on. I think if you're going to introduce Harry, you need to do it as early as possible, and having Harry be a part of Peter's obsession wall and part of the reason why he looks into the past of his parents, yeah, smart. And the idea of it cutting between, like, Peter trying to get out of the Spider-Man costume and the principal reading off the names, like, yeah, that's a really cool idea as well. I love the idea of seeing the electric eel burrowing in Max's chest. I think if they had followed Kevin Feige's notes a little more, I think The Amazing Spider-Man 2 definitely would have been a much better film. I think what Kevin Feige is proposing here is a much better version of Amazing Spider-Man 2. And I think even so much as just lifting out the parents' subplot would be enough to just make the thing flow so much better. I don't quite get the thing about Andrew Garfield's performance, but I think he was really just trying to say that the character of Peter Parker maybe just goes between emotions way too much. As it is, I mean, he saw a different cut of the film, so, you know, like, as far as what I saw, I thought Andrew Garfield was fantastic. I think most people thought Andrew Garfield was fantastic, so, like, there you go, I guess. But yeah, it's safe to say that when they were releasing Amazing Spider-Man 2, like, I don't think they fixed the problems that Alan Fine had with it either. So, like, Sony president was not happy with the film. Kevin Feige was clearly not very happy with the film. Sheesh, Alan Fine didn't even realize that this was a proper reboot. It is crazy when you look at, like, all the marketing and all the hype to just think that the people making the film were feeling this little confidence in it. And yeah, makes sense. But alright, now it's time to talk about the future. Post-Amazing Spider-Man 2 Sony Panic. You're gonna love this. I sure as hell did. So the next steps for Sony Pictures were the Sinister Six movie, directed by Drew Goddard, followed by Venom, followed by The Amazing Spider-Man 3. It began with shifting a few plans around. First, Kurtzman and Orky's writing deal would be shelved, with them being moved over to executive producer positions for Amazing Spider-Man 3, Sinister Six, and Venom. With them being moved over to executive producer positions, this would mean that they would no longer get creative input on the projects. And then the Amazing Spider-Man spin-off projects would all be renamed to fit under the Amazing Spider-Man moniker. So, the Sinister Six movie would be called The Amazing Spider-Man Sinister Six. Venom would be called The Amazing Spider-Man Venom, even though The Amazing Spider-Man is not the main character of these films. So a few possible entries into Spider-Man's new cinematic universe that were workshopped under the Amazing Spider-Man banner included a Kraven the Hunter solo movie, 2 Spider-Man 2099 movies, the first one being a time travel movie going back to war times, with the sequel focusing on him returning to 2099, The Amazing Spider-Man Black Cat, The Amazing Spider-Man Carnage, featuring Emma Stone as Gwen Stacy returning to become Carnage, and then this would all lead up to their own Avengers team-up event, with Carnage, Venom, Spider-Man 2099, Black Cat, and Spider-Man all teaming up in one movie. So this being kind of, yeah, the Sony Avengers. There would also be Amazing Spider-Man Jackal, and Amazing Spider-Man The Clone Saga. We also had a potential casting list for Sony's Spider-Man Cinematic Universe. And going by this, the Sinister Six would not necessarily reflect the teased lineup during the Amazing Spider-Man 2's end credits, which implied Goblin, Rhino, Kraven, Mysterio, Vulture, and Doc Ock, as there's no mention of Mysterio and Kraven, but we do have some other members. This all comes courtesy of Comic Book Movie. So presumably Dane DeHaan and Paul Giamatti would reprise their roles as Green Goblin and Rhino. Sony wanted Ryan Gosling, Denzel Washington, Daniel Craig, and George Clooney to be in the film. There's not really any details on who they'd play, with the exception of George Clooney as a possibility for Dr. Octopus. However, also for Dr. Octopus, they were looking at Sean Penn and Woody Harrelson. A new member in consideration was Scorpia, a female counterpart to the Scorpion. Casting choices included Emily Blunt, Ruth Wilson, Emilia Clarke, and Rose Byrne. Amy Pascal remarking that Emily Blunt was looking anorexic. Yeah, Amy Pascal has an incredibly callous way of talking about her collaborators, including calling Kevin Hart a Sandman was workshopped to be a part of the team too, serving as the comic relief character. Potential names considered were Danny McBride, Chris O'Dowd, Sharlto Copley, Joel Edgerton, Jason Clarke, and Michael Pena, who I guess would have to have some kind of deal with Marvel Studios given that he was already playing Louis in the Ant-Man movies. Colin Firth was considered for Vulture, and Channing Tatum was the frontrunner for Venom. As for plot details, the Sinister Six movie would see Spider-Man approach the Sinister Six for help in fighting a new villain, Venom. However, Spider-Man's first encounter with the Sinister Six does not go too well. Now, bear in mind it is a writer's job to take these producer notes and make them work, because as it currently stands, Amy Pascal's idea here is laughable. So, Spider-Man approaches the Sinister Six in a new black suit. The Sinister Six laugh at Spider-Man's new black suit, causing Peter to cry, take it off, switching back to the red suit, and all of this would result in a climactic team-up between Spider-Man and the Sinister Six against Venom. So again, as bad as the storytelling in Sony movies can be, I don't think there's any chance that that would be the reason why Spider-Man would ditch the black suit. Now, Spider-Man will have gotten the black suit from Venom rather than the other way around. The Venom movie would then focus on Venom going up against Carnage. Carnage, who is not serial killer Cletus Cassidy, but homeless guy Cletus Cassidy, who I guess gets the suit from the black-suited Spider-Man and takes on the Carnage moniker as it is a reflection of all of the carnage that exists in the world. So, from the sounds of it, the Spider-Man appearances in Venom and the Sinister Six would be strictly Spider-Man, not necessarily following Peter in any sense. We'd pick up his story in The Amazing Spider-Man 3, where we'd see some of the unused concepts from The Amazing Spider-Man 2 finally come into play. So this information here comes from Ryan Unicum, director and producer of the Seven Friends, George Miller's Justice League documentary. So Peter would attend group grief counseling, and this is where he would meet Mary Jane Watson, who would go on to become the new love interest. Norman Osborn's head was being preserved in a jar, hinting at a possible resurrection, and Norman becoming the Green Goblin as the villain for this film. Sony, what if I told you there are more Spider-Man villains than the Green Goblin? Now, this next piece of information about Amazing Spider-Man 3 comes from an interview with Dennis Leary. Dennis Leary was signed on to return as Captain George Stacy in The Amazing Spider-Man 3 for a big comeback, as Peter would be working on a new regenerative formula to bring back his loved ones. This would possibly lead into Sony's plans for Gwen Stacy to become Carnage in their universe, I guess taking up the mantle from Cletus Cassidy. And then The Amazing Spider-Man 4 would be an adaptation of Kraven's Last Hunt. There were also talks of an Aunt May prequel spin-off movie. This would be an espionage thriller taking cues from the Marvel comic Trouble, which was released back in 2003, a mini-series that revealed that Aunt May was actually Peter's biological mother, as she ends up pregnant as a teenager thanks to Richard Parker, but decides to let Richard and Mary raise the baby Peter on their own, and keep it a secret that she was Peter's biological mother. What the fuck? Aunt May and Uncle Ben have always been portrayed as significantly older than Richard and Mary Parker. So if May was impregnated as a teen, how young was Richard Parker? Also, isn't this whole thing just a bit weird and incestuous? Well, it went over so poorly with fans that Marvel completely abandoned this attempt to highlight the adventures of the young Aunt May. Just like how they abandoned their attempt at making Peter's parents super spies. Why are Sony taking cues from the most maligned Spider-Man stories ever? What's next? A One More Day adaptation? Oh hey, would you look at that? I'm guessing they weren't gonna follow the Trouble book religiously. I would certainly hope not anyway. How the hell do you mark an Aunt May movie anyway? Sony, you're overcomplicating things so badly. Just make a Spider-Man movie. Just get back to the basics. That's all anyone wants. Bottom line, it was a shit show. All of this born out of The Amazing Spider-Man back in 2012? A film that just wanted to tell a story about Peter Parker finding his purpose in life. The Amazing Spider-Man as we knew him was effectively dead and buried. Like, the retrofit from The Amazing Spider-Man 2 ain't kidding. This is unrecognizable at this point. At this time, Sony were firmly against any kind of shared deal between themselves and Disney, with Amy Pascal responding to Kevin Feige's suggestion of a crossover in a hostile manner, as she stated in the New York Times that she might have even thrown a sandwich at him. This is a professional. This is what industry higher-ups are like, people. Amy Pascal, ladies and gentlemen. Admittedly, though, she was under a lot of pressure to figure out a future for one of the most hot-ticket IPs that the company had. And so, she eventually came around and a Spidey Summit was held in early 2015, with her, executives Doug Belgrad, Michael Linton, Stephen Burch, and Michael DeLuca, as well as Avi Arad, Matt Tolmach, Kevin Feige, and Louis Esposito. This summit would determine the future of Spider-Man, whether the license would be sold to Disney, shared between Disney and Sony, or held by Sony entirely. Amy Pascal and the executives had compiled a series of ideas to present during the summit, including Emma Stone returning for a Carnage movie, Andrew Garfield signing onto a 5-picture deal, Dane DeHaan signing onto a 3-picture deal, a $1.5 billion deal to sell the film rights to Spider-Man wholesale to Disney, possible additional deals, Marvel Studios taking Spider-Man in exchange for 2 other Marvel properties. Sony were thinking of Thor and Daredevil. Imagine that. Imagine a Sony Thor movie. Now, I don't know if the live-action Spider-Man movie rights are different from the animated version's rights, but one idea noted down was to sell the film rights, but make The Amazing Spider-Man 3 into an animated film starring Andrew Garfield voicing the character. Other ideas were the Sinister Six split into 2 parts under the Amazing Spider-Man heading, aiming for $2 billion at the box office. Their plan to achieve this was to, and I quote, utilize exciting and dramatic special effects. Other plans were to possibly revive the Sam Raimi Spider-Man series with a Spider-Man 4 directed by Sam Raimi starring Tobey Maguire and Kirsten Dunst. This would lead into Spider-Man vs. The Amazing Spider-Man, a crossover featuring Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield expected to make $2 billion at the box office. It looks like Amy Pascal, Avi Arad, and Matt Tolmach had decided on The Amazing Spider-Man Sinister Six Part 1 and 2 effectively being treated as The Amazing Spider-Man 3. Venom would shift its slated date to 2018, the same year as Amazing Spider-Man 4 Part 1, with Part 2 releasing in 2019. Amy Pascal was gunning for Avi Arad to remain as a producer, noting him as essential to any Spider-Man movie, and that any deal made with Disney would still involve him as the producer. Amy Pascal, Avi Arad, and Doug Belgrad were all on board with these ideas. However, Michael, it doesn't say which of the 2 Michaels this was, be it DeLuca or Linton, was more interested in the idea of a full reboot shared between Marvel Studios and Sony Pictures. Spider-Man would appear in Captain America Civil War and Avengers Infinity War, while Sony would produce a solo movie to release in 2017, along with a sequel in 2019. Dylan O'Brien was a desired actor for Peter Parker, with the series starting in high school. Sony Pictures would get the final creative say. Marvel Studios would co-finance the films. In exchange, Marvel could use Spider-Man. Another piece of leverage was that Sony wanted to win back the TV show license for Spider-Man as well, which I'd be in favor of because, like, the Disney Spider-Man cartoons so far have sucked absolute donkey dick, while the Spectacular Spider-Man remains goated to this day. The price for a Spider-Man license deal wholesale was up to $5 billion based on the size of the IP. So, the ideas are presented to Kevin Feige and Louis Esposito, and Kevin Feige is not impressed. The deals are too one-sided. The prices are too high. The least Sony are willing to accept for the rights to Spider-Man is $3 billion. The most Marvel are willing to pay is $2 billion. Sony agree to that, but on the condition that they still partially own the franchise. And so, a final deal was on the table. Spider-Man would appear in Captain America Civil War, played by Andrew Garfield. The Amazing Spider-Man 3 drops in 2017, produced by Avi Arad and Sam Raimi, with the Russo brothers directing. Marvel Studios would be allowed to recast everybody except for Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man. Spider-Man would then make 2 more appearances in MCU crossover films before The Amazing Spider-Man 4 would be released in 2019. Then in 2020, Spider-Man vs. The Amazing Spider-Man starring Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. Then after this, for the small sum of $2 billion, Spider-Man would belong to Marvel Studios forever. But obviously things didn't quite work out that way, as Andrew Garfield would not return as Spider-Man for Sony and Marvel Studios' collaborative efforts. So, Andrew Garfield. He was meant to be attending a lavish Sony conference in Brazil. Shareholders, executives, higher-ups, where he'd be unveiled as Spider-Man, the face of Sony Pictures, their big cash cow. But, according to Amy Pascal, at the very last minute, Andrew Garfield had cancelled because, and again, this is according to Amy Pascal, someone who does not live in the real world, Andrew pulled out because he had a scruffy beard and wanted to be left alone. There are different reports about why Andrew Garfield backed out. There are Pascal's report that he's just a scruffy guy. There are reports citing far more with Andrew that he took a fan to Disneyland or something. And then there are reports that he was just sick. But Andrew Garfield made sure to clarify that he was not trying to sabotage his career as Spidey. With this though, Andrew Garfield was fired as Spider-Man, and so plans reshuffled to the other option. a brand new Spider-Man, possibly Dylan O'Brien, back in high school. And with that, the Amazing Spider-Man franchise was officially dead. And like a Russian doll out of the corpse of the Amazing Spider-Man came a brand new one. And Sony were determined to get this one right, providing Marvel Studios with a character integrity obligation document, stating that this new Peter Parker could not torture, kill, smoke, sell drugs, or abuse alcohol unless he was wearing the black suit. Just imagining the black-suited Spider-Man dealing cocaine. However, he absolutely could not have sex before the age of 16, or have sex with anyone under the age of 16. Yeah, that tracks. And this one is very important. He cannot be homosexual, unless Marvel wants him to be. He also had to be white. And so our new, definitely not gay, possibly a drug dealer when wearing the black suit Spider-Man was born. And the rest is history, folks. And so the era of Sony live-action Spider-Man movies comes to a close. And what have we learned? Sony were never going to recognize and return to what made The Amazing Spider-Man 1 great. Whether Andrew Garfield had stayed on or not, like, this was just how it was. This was a constantly changing character. I'll say this, splitting movies into multiple parts wasn't actually an awful idea, given how The Amazing Spider-Man 2 absolutely suffered from an abundance of story. What also just strikes me as bizarre, though, is how, like, Sony will do these drastic reboots without getting in any new blood. The Amazing Spider-Man was produced by all the same people that produced the Sam Raimi trilogy. Heck, Alvin Sargent was the writer of The Amazing Spider-Man, and he wrote for Spider-Man 2 and 3. Not only that, Sony wanted Sam Raimi to produce The Amazing Spider-Man 3? I can't see that happening. But also, if you're gonna do these big, ambitious reboots, it surely makes a ton of sense to get new blood in. But that's just kind of how Hollywood is. It's all about reputation. It's all about what worked before. And to be fair, I still think The Amazing Spider-Man 1 was an excellent film. What's funny to me, though, is that the Spidey Summit email ended up being kind of prophetic. And now, yeah, Sony's plans did come to be. We got a Venom movie. We got 2 of them. Kraven the Hunter is getting a solo film with Aaron Taylor-Johnson in the role. Sony does still appear to be building up to a Sinister Six for their movie universe. Spider-Man movies did release in 2017 and 2019, with Spider-Man returning to high school. The plans for an animated Amazing Spider-Man 3 weren't too far off base, as we are now getting animated movies with the Spider-Verse films. And albeit a year later than Sony had originally hoped, we did get a Spider-Man movie featuring Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield appearing side by side. It's crazy what these little documents revealed to us. And what have we learned? Uber-rich movie producers are not normal people. Jesus Christ. The Amazing Spider-Man series, you funny little franchise. You started off so strong with The Amazing Spider-Man. The Amazing Spider-Man was a real contender. It's fully understandable why it is in the conversation surrounding what some of the best Spider-Man movies are. You can see why this film speaks so much to people. It's a film about people, it's a film about purpose. And The Amazing Spider-Man 2 showcased that they were kind of losing track of that, and these emails just reveal they were too far gone. Whether or not you like the Spider-Man movies that we're getting now, I feel like they are at the very least better and have a clear idea of what they want to do than what Sony were presenting in these emails here. The time between The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and the inevitable reboot was a really dark time for this character. So they really needed to bring it home if they were going to get Spider-Man back on his feet. So next time, we'll be talking about the beginnings of the MCU Spider-Man, from Captain America Civil War to Spider-Man Homecoming. I'll catch you there. If you want your name in the credits of my videos, you can do so for as little as $1 a month via Patreon, as well as getting additional content. But for now, a special shout out goes to the patrons in the $10 tier. Their names are Kale Bennett, That Jordo, King K, Legendary Ray Ray, Dr. SP here with your PSA for the day. Yes, I'm a real doctor. You can't prove anything. Sergio, Cyrus the Skeptic, I love the Boss Baby movies. I'm the biggest fan. And of course, then in the $5 tier and above, we got Broski, SSS06, Dazzle Fizzle, and Council of Geeks. Thank you guys so much for your generosity, and thank you to all of you watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, hit the like button, comment below, we'll discuss, and until the next time, you guys have a great day. Farewell.